This is the story of a people who left their homeland in Central Europe and in the second half of the 19th century joined a great migration to the United States of America. These immigrants came mostly from small villages in Bohemia, with the largest numbers from the village centers of Hostau, Muttersdorf, and Ronsburg. These were farm communities, where the people lived close to the land, going out daily to work in their scattered fields. Their daily lives were enriched by their traditions. They enjoyed good food and good beer. Music in every form, bands, singing societies, and choirs, permeated all aspects of village life. Deeply religious people, from New Year's Day to Christmas they observed holy days and special celebrations, and then gathered as a community for weddings and funerals. For the most part, they came to this country as poor immigrants. Although they did not bring great wealth, they brought with them something far more valuable. There is a German word, Heimat, which is usually translated as homeland, but that fails to capture all its true meaning. A love of Heimat encompasses local history and language. It is music and art and poetry. It is bound above all to the land, to faith, and to family. As these German Bohemian immigrants made their home in a new land, they transferred their Heimat here, much like a gardener carefully digs the earth around a flower, carries it to new soil, plants it once again, and then tends to its care. It is a homeland transplanted. That Heimat has been passed on from one generation to the next, and these are some of their stories.
George was the young. They lived in a small house in Neuboy, and he was the youngest son.
Okay.
And the chances of him ever having any property or land in the old country was nil. His older brother would have, in fact, in their house in the 1850 census, there were 3 extended families living in this little house, and it was very small. So consequently, there was no opportunity for him, and so he had the choice of going to the big city and trying to get employment there, or emigrating, and that's why he left. So economics, in this case, was always the reason for immigration.
Great-great-grandfather came over with his wife. He was 70 years old, and she was 67. And to this day, I wonder what made him come here. I mean, he had spent his whole life, he had only known that piece of land that he lived on. He was 70 years old. He knew he wasn't going to live a whole lot more years. Although some of his family was here, some of his family was still there. The only church he had ever gone to was still there. The cemetery where all his ancestors were buried was there. Why did you come? What was the draw for you to come? That's what I would like to ask him. I just can't imagine what that would be.
Yeah, I'd like to know how hard it was, you know? I mean, were they being insightful about the future? Were they so desperate that they just had to leave? And, you know, how much did they look back? How much did they regret? Or if they would have done anything differently? Because our lives are so different by them coming here. I have the trunk too, by the way. I mean, to speak of what they might physically bring, it's just huge. I mean, you see immigrant trunks and people use them for quilts and stuff. You could put 100 quilts in this thing. It's huge. It's so heavy. It says Joseph Schweinfurter, Neu-Ulm. Yeah, really wonderful. It's really neat.
And so that's where
The Otter arrived about 10 o'clock Sunday morning with 40 tons of freight and 40 German immigrants direct from Bohemia. They are going to settle in this vicinity, which will be enriched to that extent. Her passengers were Wilczek and family, Hubel and family, Smarzol and sister Eva, Anna Wiesner, Jean Lilla, Joseph Flor, Andreas Richter, Anna Nunn, Sprenger and family, Magdalena Steffel. The Minnesota River is falling. It is too low already.
We don't know when they left Bohemia. We don't know when they left Bremen, but we know their point of debarkation was April 1st, 1871, Baltimore. So in a way, I could characterize this trip as pretty fast. We know from the Pilsen archives that they sold their place in Amplatz, Bohemia, March 6th, 1871. So we don't know when they got to Bremen, but we know that just a few weeks later, April 1st, they were in Baltimore, Maryland. And then according to this article, we know that they arrived Sunday, April 14th. And then we also know that they had purchased their farm, of which the Wilczeks still are at yet, in April 28th of 1871. So before the month of April was out, they had traveled to Bremen, came across the Atlantic Ocean, traveled from Baltimore to Chicago, St. Paul, New Ulm, purchased their house, and were on their farm before the month of April was out.
That's really interesting. The first immigrants remained close to the land. Like the Wilczeks, other German Bohemian settlers bought up farms in Cottonwood, Siegel, and Stark townships, and across the Minnesota River in West Newton and Lafayette townships. Wanda Gog called her ancestors my solid peasant forebears. They were a simple people who worked the land. In 1897, the New Ulm News described rural German Bohemians as a thrifty people, buying land for farms, erecting their little two-room houses as soon as settled in the country, and devoting themselves to work, never for a moment tolerating a pair of idle hands. For those who remained on the farm, traditions have been passed down from generation to generation.
Yeah, milking cows and chickens and hogs and exactly. But it was only a 160-acre farm out in Siegel. But he got the four of us. We grew up.
Was a lot of it to feed
Oh yeah.
the family?
Yes, the feed.
Did you sell some stuff?
Oh sure, yes. But in the beginning, it was mostly for the livestock, and we always milked a few cows and
Hogs?
and we had hogs. Yes, yeah, absolutely. Yep.
Did you do ducks?
Yeah, we had ducks, but we wouldn't let the female duck raise her own because she'd take them immediately to the slough and the fox would get them and the skunks. So we had chicken hens that would raise our ducks for us, and they didn't take them down to the slough right away. But every now and then there would be a duck that would be inbred and didn't know if he was a chicken or if he was a duck. I know one Drake, he fell in love with all the chicken hens. So I knew there was a problem, but poor guy.
My favorite tractor was a 1945 John Deere B with a flywheel start. Yep, I thought I could do anything and everything with that. I would follow my dad all around that farm place with his bigger tractors. I thought I could do anything he could with this little thing.
So when was the first time how old were you when you first drove the tractor?
I would guess 7 years old. That sounds a little too young, for sure 9. But my older brother was away at the seminary, so I was the oldest one at home, and I was pretty well called into duty.
But one of the benefits of having a John Deere tractor is it had a hand clutch. My legs wouldn't have been long enough to put in the clutch of a farmall tractor. So my dad had me driving out that tractor a lot. But I remember the first time driving, pulling a baler, and my dad would be stacking the hay behind me, and I'd look back and I'd see where I'd miss a lot because I couldn't drive straight. I was pretty scared, you know, the whole learning process. But I remember that well, a John Deere B.
Oh, in those days, there was a large wooden container very similar to a bathtub. Mm-hmm. You filled that with hot water. Mm-hmm. You put the hog in there, rolled them around a little bit. Yeah. Then you brought them up and you laid them on a table. Okay. And then there was kind of a round bell-shaped, but it had a handle on it. Then you would scrape off all the hair that were on that hog. Okay. Yeah. And then when that got done, then he was hung up on a single tree in a tree, and then he would be gutted. And most of the time, those days, they left the hide on. Oh. Nowadays, the hide gets removed. Okay.
But there was a lot of communications between neighborhoods. Mm-hmm. And if somebody needed help, the neighbors would come together. Okay. You know, they'd build buildings, trashing, corn shredding, mm-hmm. Oh yeah, silo filling, oh yeah, that big crews, you know, yeah.
Yeah. Did you have people come in and hired help in the summer or in the fall?
Usually in trashing in the fall. Yeah. Well, my dad had a hired man for quite a few years.
Oh, okay.
Yeah, a hired man for a few years. The most interesting hired help we had mm-hmm. was when they had German prisoners here in Newell, yeah. and we could hire them. Uh-huh. And we had two of them, Joseph Wassernauer and Joseph Flitsch. And they had white caps. Okay. Not everybody had white caps. There was only a few white caps. Okay. And I could speak enough German, so I drove the team horses and they loaded the wagon. Yeah. You know? And then I asked him one day, I said, how come you two guys got white caps? And it got kind of quiet. Nobody really said anything. And finally, Flitsch finally said, well, he said, we're trusted more than the rest of them. Oh. So we got the white caps. Yeah. Yeah. Anyway, I learned from those two guys.
We started out with the white ones as a surprise for he and I think it was on our 10th birthday. Never knew it, but Ernie and my dad had gone up to the hay barn and built this beautiful loft. I mean, he did just a super job. Man, and he had boards that lapped together, and I go, wow, what a Taj Mahal. And in it were 6 white pigeons, white kings, and they came from Art and Alfred Kretsch. Because every Sunday when we went to this farm place, where that nice red barn sits and the pigeonholes, that's what Paul and I did. We'd watch those pigeons and we'd go, God, we love them. And then they had the black, white, they were the reverse wing croppers, and they were black and red. And then the big white kings. We loved them. So the white ones, I liked the white ones. He wanted the other ones. Yeah, yeah. But he was happy. Well, it turned out a few years later, there were 200 of them. They were prolific. Man, did they breed. But were they good eating. But every time there were too many of them flying around, Dad would say, boys, time to butcher. Paul would cry. Because all 200 had a name. Yeah. He baptized every one of them. Yeah. So unfortunately, but I loved eating them, and there was another special meal with pigeons, dumplings, and gravy. Oh my gosh. And as far as I've heard and know of, even the trips I've taken, pigeons were a big part of the German people and German Bohemian. They did raise them for eating. And just the cooing, the peacefulness around the place. And but when you got 200 of them, there's a lot of cooing. It was a racket, but I loved it.
So you didn't have to go and buy any new ones, very.
Bringing up another subject.
Yeah, tell me. I'm really interested in this.
Sorghum. Everybody out in that area grew sorghum. And then came the time to make that into molasses. And guess where the press was? Right next door. And right in the Theodore Static farm. And for that 6 weeks of aroma, it was beautiful. And especially when a little northwest breeze would come. My God. But anyway, you'd cut the sorghum and you'd only bring the stalks over. And they would feed it into that, and it was only your batch that was done.
Oh, okay.
The pan that they cooked it in was 16 feet by 4 feet. And then Linus Moore did usually most of it, and he'd walk around with a big wooden stir, and he'd keep stirring it constantly, and they'd cook it until all the green stuff was taken off. He'd remove all of that, and it was perfectly clear. And when it was clear, it was ready. And then if you brought your own containers, it would cost you less. And if you brought your own firewood, it would cost you less. So those were the options. But then Dad usually brought these gallon jugs, you know, like with a little handle and a little, and with funnels, they'd fill that up. And we brought our jugs of molasses, and it would last forever. It would never spoil. Once it was cooked like that, but good. That's where the molasses bread in the morning came from. Oh, and then I asked Menno Static. Now that interview with Menno, he worked with that press. He said it's a miracle nobody ever got their hands in there, and the press, because there were no safeguards. He said the worst thing that ever went through was a guy's glove.
I don't know if you are aware of this or not. On that particular farm where they had lived, originally there was a distillery down there.
I didn't know that.
Owned by professional people here in town, doctors and lawyers and what have you. And they had their own copper kettle down there, and they made their own moonshine. Suppose they shared, but maybe they also sold some. There would always be, my dad would say, there was always truckloads of sugar that got hauled down there to use in this distillery. And this mash, yeah.
Wow.
But then eventually the feds got wind of that place, went down in there, and they arrested the doctors and the lawyers. They never got caught or arrested. But one guy did, and he had to spend some time in prison. I don't know his name. I have no idea if he was from New Ulm or Sleepy Eye, or I have no idea where he was from.
Interesting.
Yeah.
No.
See, in the 20s and 30s, everybody was building brand new barns. And then, of course, there you had this immense floor, this hay barn floor. And not a board was warped yet. Everything was straight, nailed down. What a good time to have a dance. So then they'd put up a makeshift stage, and the old-time band would get there, and they had a chivalry barn dance. And that went on and on. Now the barn dances in the Siegel area and the barn dances in the Stark area were a little different. Siegel, it was laughter and having fun and not really any trouble. Stark, the main objective of the guys was to go into their little blacksmith shop on the farm, polish their brass knuckles, and give her hell.
Really?
And it was very sad if they did not have a good knockdown, drag-out fight. The barn dance was a failure. Little rougher type of guys. Hirschawa. That's why they were called the Hirschawa. I don't know if that meant like hillbillies or what it meant, but it means, there's a place in Germany called Hirschawa.
Well, I know that.
Every week was a family thing, whether it was at our house or their house, or, I mean, that was just friends. We had such big relation. Those were our friends.
Yeah.
I mean, you know, and being musicians, especially the Franas, they were all musicians. They played the concertinas and clarinets, and the organ, the piano, I mean, you name it, they were. And Jeff Rana is still playing the concertina, and he plays all over New Ulm. And we'd roll up the carpet, Aunt and Uncle would roll up the carpet, and we'd dance in the wintertime, and they would play. And if there was a wedding, whether it would be in a barn dance or whatever, it would go on until breakfast. We'd have breakfast, and then we'd go home. I mean, it just really was one party after party, and we'd just all be very, very happy to be all together, because usually it was just several couples that you would be with, 2 or 3 couples at a time. Never was one. I don't know, we couldn't wait to eat and play because there were so many children to turn around and play. But I know there was always meat and mashed potatoes and Jell-O. I remember those 3 things. It was a lot of fun, it really was, because you could play in their groves, you could drive the tractor, you know, when you're 8 and 10 years old.
Really?
I mean, those, oh, absolutely. You couldn't get by with a lot of stuff that we turned around and we did. We picked eggs, you know, we did chores for them, just as well that had to be done, you know, when we were visiting. And then we'd stay for a week to 2 weeks also. The boys would have one bed and the girls would have one bed, and we'd all crawl in. We didn't think anything of it, you know. I mean, that was the way it was. It was wonderful.
In fact, I damn near drowned one time. Pat Eckstein's 2 older brothers and we went down to that Flandreau group camp. At that time, the dam was still in. So, and then there was kind of a dock going out there. And anyway, we'd go down there to do our swimming, although neither one of us really knew how to swim. And anyway, at the time we were down there, then there was a group of Girl Scouts in occupying those buildings. And of course, there was Girl Scout lifeguards out there then too. So anyway, for some reason or other, I decided I was going to walk out quite a ways to see how deep the water was. And all at once I stepped into a hole, and then I really found out how deep it was. And when I surfaced, then I quickly hollered, "Help, help, help." And then this lifeguard, well, she came in and helped me out with that.
The early immigrants lived in the country, but as more arrived, many settled in the city of New Ulm and in some of the small communities to the west and north. The largest concentration of German Bohemians was found in Goostown. New Ulm is built on a series of terraces rising up from the river. Minnesota Street was the city's commercial district, and most homes were built either along Minnesota, German, and Broadway streets, or up on the next tier on State, Washington, Jefferson, and Franklin. Down by the river, on the wrong side of the railroad tracks, near the flour mills, a brewery, and a stockyard, land was cheaper, and so a German Bohemian neighborhood grew up. By 1884, the name of Goostown is found in local newspapers, so called because of the number of geese that were raised there by German Bohemians.
I would say when I was growing up and looked back on Goostown, which was still there and still there today, that the people that lived down there were probably lower income folks, but very hardworking. They still grew their vegetable gardens, and they had chickens in the backyard. Some of them even might have had a cow for milking and that. In the southern border, we lived on, like I said, about 7th South, and there were definitely homes the next couple blocks, but after that, I remember it just being kind of open field, and I remember there were cattle grazing in there, and people did have gardens in that area too. So as time goes on, the lines got a little blurred because people started building homes farther south on Valley and Front Street, and it kind of expanded.
And they used the geese for lard, feathers for clothing and everything, and blankets and stuff like that. Most everybody, and they would be going right down the streets. I can remember as a kid too.
Did you go down to the river much?
Yes, we did. Sometimes without parents' permission, because we were strictly told, don't go anywhere near the river without us. But we'd be playing with the kids along Front Street, and one of the kids, let's go down to the river. And I'd kind of look around, I didn't see Mom or Dad, and we'd sneak down there. But otherwise we would go down. Dad would take us fishing on occasion during the summer, and that was it. So we had a very small little world there.
Just think of stories my father talking about, and my mother for that matter as well, talking about careers on the river, if you will. How people would take the clam shells and do the rough pearling, looking for that, but then they would also harvest the inside of those shells that would somehow be turned into the pearl appearing buttons, the flat buttons and things. There was a whole industry that evidently New Ulm people used to provide that and do that, and it was probably where the boat landing is today on the north end of Riverside Park, that was kind of the area where that happened. And I recall Dad saying that sometimes people, when they were down on their luck, would still try to do that. There no longer were the masses of clams that there used to be, but they would try to make a living with, or at least pick up a few extra dollars by harvesting.
I can remember also on 8th South, right in the middle of the street, was a well.
Oh, really?
There was a well. The water, New Ulm is on a plain.
Right, the terraces.
Yeah, but all the way from Dakota, we got that water, and that water was clear water. Okay. There also was out on Highway 15 or 14. There was a pump, water. Not a pump. The water would just run out of a pipe out there. They had stones there. It was very clear, very nice. We'd always go, well, somebody maybe have a car, and we'd drive out there, go out and get a drink of water, whatever. And I can remember that when the people did the canning, everyone could go to that water out there on 8th Street, and they would get water, good clear water. When we were young kids, I went to first grade at Catholic school up there, because we lived down here, down by the mill, down to where there was a tavern there. The two guys owned the tavern and stuff, but the guys get off the mill and stuff, and they get out. And I always said that's where I learned how to swear, because they sit back in that little thing that they had where what did they call those things at that time? Little garden things. They sit and they drink their beer and get drunk. But
and you did hear about how tough it was, how tough the people were, and the groups of young men that would get into brawls with the so-called uptown boys. Uptown boys were the people that lived probably from Minnesota Street on west, especially around the cathedral, in that general area.
I grew up being this happy-go-lucky little kid with all the confidence in the world. Never thought about right side of the tracks, wrong side of the tracks. And to this day, I don't think that anyone else really ever thought of it in that context. At least I never experienced it. I was fortunate, perhaps. But I never experienced it, where anybody would say, oh, you live on Valley Street, or oh, you live on Front Street. Oh, you're on the wrong side of the tracks. I think you grew up with kind of a pride from being the hard-working, the work ethic, enjoying good times, the neighborhoods in Goosetown. Having that just kind of gave people a certain confidence and backbone where I don't believe people in New Ulm ever felt that you were. Now, some might differ with me. In fact, I have heard other previous residents of Goosetown say that, oh, no, they all look down on us. And I thought, no, you just don't have enough self-confidence that I didn't see that anybody did at all.
Other families congregated near Holy Trinity Church and School, founded in 1869 by a charismatic priest, the Reverend Alexander Berghold. A native of Austria, he forged a close bond with the area's German Bohemians. Nearby streets were dotted with the homes of retired farmers who moved to town after passing their fields and livestock on to their children. Of course, the church was not the only place where German Bohemians gathered. They might pick up groceries at nearby corner stores, or play in the fields around the county fairgrounds. And of course, there was the nearby tavern.
But it was right on the corner, and a lot of German Bohemians, after Sunday Mass, they would go and stop at Smiley's, the guys anyway. And the mamas had to go home and cook the big dinner. So, well, obviously they had been fasting if they were going to communion, and after a couple of beers, they got kind of noisy.
That all the time, either down at the Snake House,
Yeah, the thing about that Dumeyer's Bar, that corner, I remember that the first time when I had to go from Siegel to town school to make my communion at Holy Trinity. So that was second grade, so 1952 or so. That was a big deal for me.
Yeah.
But every once in a while we'd get a nickel from Ma, so after school we could go over to the, there was a bar on one side, and so we remember going in there and we'd want to get some candy, but Bernie Domeyer, he was tending bar on the other side, so there was a little doorway in between the two, so he had come from the bar over here to get us kids some candy. I remember that.
You know what, to this day, when I had my shop in there, I started in 1968 till 76, Anyhow, in the basement, Clem Besicek and all those guys played high-class poker down in my basement. They'd come in the back by Dumeyer's and went downstairs, and there was no other doors except coming down there where they put their beer barrels down there too. And those guys would sit down there, and there'd be $100 bills on a goddamn table, and Clarence Scheffler and all those guys Besicek and Pat Hoffman, the two brothers, and Tillman. Anyhow, when I sold out there and quit in 76, down in the basement was a great big hunk of concrete with 4 bolts in it, and that's where they had their motor sitting, and they had a counter shaft up on the top. They had their meat grinder, their sausage mixer, all that stuff. Ben Fetter made all their sausage in the basement, and he had 2 walk-in smokehouses in the basement. And as far as I know, they're still down in there. No kidding. That butcher shop, he liked that. They made darn good food there.
When I was at Trinity High School, that south wing was where our high school classes
Yes, it was.
And Stan Wilford lived across the street from there. And he had taught Ben Vetter. He had great big numbers, and when the World Series was on, during the day, that they were all daytime. He would put the World Series scores on the side of the building.
So you guys
so
could
we would, yeah. Oh yeah, honest to God.
I believe it.
Yep. Oh, absolutely.
And I remember as a boy, I was probably 3-4 years old. My grandmother at 600 North Jefferson had a cow, along with the chickens and the ducks. And many beautiful summer days, I was asked to be there about 8:30, 8 in the morning, and I would walk along with the cow down to below the hospital, which was grazing area. And many people who had a cow would take their cow down there and would graze on the grass. And then I would walk home with it. I never lit it because the cow knew what it was doing. I just would go around. And then my grandma would milk it. And we got back, and then I'd have to take a little can of this warm milk home with me. And then my mom would want me to drink some of that warm milk, and to this day, I do not drink milk.
And the store probably was, I would say, almost a mile, was the Arndt's grocery store. That was the closest store. For us, a small one, if you needed bread or milk or anything like that, on our way to school or back, we'd go that way. Where it was a small grocery store, they had 7 kids, and they lived above it.
Yeah, there was 2 ice houses in town. One was where, Gog Sheet Metal had the building on 3rd North in front. There was one, and then on 5th North, between Washington and Franklin, there was a big barn, and that was filled with ice every winter. That was quite an operation. My neighbor across the street from us owned 38 horses, a lot of them 20 mile, and most of them were working horses. And he would rent out his horses to the guys making ice. They go down to the river, and with big saws, hand saws, they'd saw big chunks of ice, pull them up on a sled onto a bigger sled, up to the storage building, and wrapped around straw. And that kept it for quite a few months.
Finally, there was the Wallahai, down in the lowland on the south side of town. The origin of the name Wallahai is obscure, but it is most likely a translation of the phrase lowland horse pasture. Here lived a few large families with big gardens, numerous farm animals, flocks of chickens, and outdoor privies. There was a small grocery, a mink ranch, a gravel pit, and, of course, the Hauenstein Brewery. But it was known as a tough, hard-working neighborhood where outsiders were not always welcome.
Well,
in one of the earliest newspaper references to the neighborhood in 1908,
I would say that was kind of the outskirts of the Wallahai.
The ways of the Wallahai are past understanding. The people out there should be set off in a community by themselves.
Down in Jefferson and Payne Street, down in there.
Now, did you sort of know you weren't supposed to go down there? Or?
Well, now I told you my mother's brother lived on the home place on 12th South, which is now Payne Street. Right. And he had a cow. And so every Friday he had milk, and my mother would bake on Saturday. Yeah. So we had to go over there and get a pail full of milk. And so we had to somehow go through the heart of the Wallahai, where the Fredericks and the Krauses and those people lived, and they had the reputation for being kind of didn't take kindly to outsiders, you might say, or anybody. So a lot of times we just walked down Franklin Street to 12th and then over to my uncle's place. But yeah, because Saturday morning was time to bake rolls and coffee cakes and that kind of stuff, and she'd use that milk and cream for that.
When I first got in there, I had a fight.
You did?
Oh yeah.
Tell me about it. What happened?
Well, they just challenged you. They just challenged you. And if you didn't fight, you had trouble because everybody was going to do it. So you had to take it, you know, so you maybe got a couple licks in or got a couple licks not in or whatever else, you know. I can remember going to school together. We all went to school together, but one of the guys if they had the lunch bucket and he got mad at you, they would come chasing him with the lunch bucket.
Summer, when we were in high school, we had a summer league. They had softball between the various parks. Walla High kids were from Lincoln Park, and the north siders were from Washington Park. We had some pretty tense rivalry games.
That was the good part about going to St. Mary's.
What?
Because the Goose Towners would be going to St. Mary's. Yeah. So would us Walla High, and then the farmers. That's where I met Pat Kretsch for the first time. And Johnny Gog. You know, they're just a couple of years older than me, but of course, being the younger one, you always look up to those type of people. And that way, I could never really get on the outs with any of that South Side gang bunch. And then when I moved to the North Side, it was the Hamises and the Dumeyers who were close to, and they were kind of the controllers of the North Side. So now I'm fitting in with the South Siders and North Siders. I never really worried much about getting in any troubles.
My uncle had a little grocery store on the front of their house. They converted their, built on in what later became a living room and a family room, but anyway, it was a little grocery store. And in that era, there were lots of little neighborhood grocery stores. I remember I counted them several times, and I'm not recalling how many, but when you start enumerating, my goodness, we had, you know, from Arndt's and Nunn's and the Walla High. It was called the Walla High Grocery. In fact, yeah, my uncle and aunt had that.
A musical mecca, and much of that reputation rests on the traditions of German Bohemians. One of Minnesota's greatest band leaders, Joseph Hofmeister, was born in Bohemia and came to Milford Township in 1880. Under his baton, the 2nd Regiment Band became recognized as the finest in all of Minnesota. John Lindmeyer and the original Goosetown Band have been credited with transplanting German Bohemian music to New Ulm. They had played together while still in Europe and brought their instruments with them, performing at barn dances, at weddings, and, as some recall, on the front lawns of Goosetown on summer evenings. New Ulm's first ambassador of German music, though, was Whoopi John Wilford. As a young man, Whoopi John, a concertina player, and his brother Eddie, a clarinetist, formed a band to play at local dances. As his reputation as an entertainer grew, Wilford headed to a bigger stage in the Twin Cities in 1924, when he began a regular broadcast on WCCO radio and signed contracts with national recording labels. Dozens of bands followed in his footsteps. In 1954, Collier's magazine picked up on the story, labeling New Ulm as the Oompa town. A Collier's photographer captured the spirit by lining up 52 musicians for a mass picture, and still missed 12 local bands.
Down the streets of New Ulm, any day of the week, children wrapped in tubas trundle along to their music lessons. When a child is born, the townspeople say, he is given his choice between a brass horn and a silver dollar. If he takes the dollar, his parents disown him. Evan Jones, Collier's Magazine.
One of those children of New Ulm Ben Seifert apparently took the brass horn and not the silver dollar. Growing up in the Wallahai, he turned to music at an early age.
That summer, my father, he wasn't playing his instruments anymore. He had an accordion and he had a cornet and a violin. Yeah. He played violin, cornet, and accordion. And he said, and I started already when I was 6 years old. They bought me a little accordion and a harmonica, and I put the harmonica on. I play the harmonica and the button accordion. Mm-hmm. And one summer, the neighborhood kids said, "Oh, let's have a parade, and you can play." And so we went up the Franklin Street, and then this lady said, "Oh, why don't you go downtown?" My husband, he worked at the Retzlaff. They were the Dodge dealers. It's where the old Thrifty building was. Okay. Retzlaff had their car dealership in there, and they hauled me down there on the coaster, and I played for them, and they gave us a quarter. That was my first professional engagement. So
Ben is still playing, and we joined him down at the B&L bar for a session with some of the city's legendary German Bohemian musicians.
You're listening to this one for Jerry Goldberg. He's here somewhere. He is. Yeah, he's over by the bar, John. There he is. Isn't it the Listy Wallahai Schluck? The Wallahai Schluck. It's a propane D. 1, 2.
My dad bought a concertina for my son Gary, and Gary just didn't have the knack for music, but he tried. And then Smiley took a hold of it once, and he started to finger it. So we gave him some lessons from Wenzel Fisher. Oh, perfect, yeah. And then when he got so good in playing, then Harold, my husband, and I said, gosh, he really should get out to meet people and play. So we took him to bars, and then we said, is that the right place to take a 13, 14-year-old kid to see all that drinking? And he's the only one that doesn't drink, or I mean excels, So then when he got better, then he says, Mother, I need a drummer. I need a drummer, somebody to... Well, I said, don't look at me. I was still raising a family. I had 2 girls. Oh, I don't know what age they were, 6 and 8, 8 and 10. And then we bought a drum set. And for our other son, Randy. And well, he was at the age of 16, 17, and 18, but he liked girls better than drumming. Yeah, so we can't drum. He says, Mother, you try. Well, all I did was, they called that a beat. He says, just try to keep up with me. And he'd scold me. And then I got better, so there. And I was a drummer. I enjoyed it very much. Yeah.
Go ahead. Play with them. Hurry up, hurry up.
We're looking at Zoodle Sock. That is a direct copy of the one that Mr. Beer played in the New Ulm area. It's created for me as a direct copy, and the measurements were taken from the Beers doodle sock, and this was created as a copy. And it has, except that it has the church from Neuboy, where my forefathers came from, burned into the bellows part. And the animal part is, most people think it's maybe a goat, but I'm sorry to tell you that it happens to be dog. That's where they used what they used back then too.
Right?
Yeah.
Interesting.
And another name for it is the Böhmische Bock, which is a Bohemian goat. And when some people play it like me, it sounds like a goat.
Who was the person who made it?
He was a Czech craftsman who specializes in making doodle socks, both the German variety and the Czech variety. And he lives in Domazlica, which is right across in the border areas where our forefathers came from. And this instrument is indigenous not only to the German Bohemians, but it's also to Bavarians across the border and to the Czechs. Different varieties. And this is the bellows, and this is the bag, and the drone, and the canter. The Czech variety has the drone over the back. This is what makes this an Egerlander doodle sock.
Kleine Kinder, kleine Sorgen, little children, little sorrows. Große Kinder, große Sorgen. Wowee. After you have a family, you know what that meant.
That's always, I went to school not knowing a word of English.
Really?
My brother was in school with me, and if I wanted to say something in English, I'd have to run over to him and ask, what do you say? How do you say that? You know, that was common, very common. Just like my Bohemian. I was an avid Bohemian. I can't anymore.
No.
It's all gone. I can say what Grandma told me when she was sick and tired of me. What she taught me
What did
to
she say?
Go home.
And what is that?
Go home.
I spoke Bohemian
Did you?
until I went to school in the first grade, and I did not know a word of English. So that was a lot of fun, and a lot of to where I cried and I didn't want to go to school, and so Mom and Dad worked with me until I finally kind of got over it, and eventually, by the time I got to the 8th grade, I could spell and read pretty well.
Okay. They spoke out.
I just spoke what my mom and dad spoke, and it was not German, because after I was about 12, 13 years old, there were people who spoke German around me, and I would just kind of like listen to that, and then I would think, no, that's German. So in other words, I'm not really speaking German. So it was through speaking with some other cousins that we found out that it's more of a Bohemian dialect.
We went to a country school, District 68, and stories with that, of course, when Paul and I went. My brother was almost 4 years older, so he was ahead of us. When Paul and I went, we spoke English quite well, but Ernie didn't. Ernest had a problem. And Mrs. Mertz, the teacher, noticed that. So she says, I'm going to test Ernest. So she held a picture of a black horse. And she says, Ernie, can you tell me what this is? And he says, Das ist ein schwarzer Pferd. And she went, that's nice in German, but what is it in English? He said, Das kann ich nicht. I can't do that. So back then, he stayed sitting a whole year because of not being able to speak English properly. And prior to that, when my mother and dad's generation, because they didn't think that was such a big deal, because they, at their time, all the teachers could speak either their dialect or their German. They took the time to teach them English. That was expected. Well, when our generation came along, the teachers either couldn't or were told not to. It's time everybody started speaking English. But Ernest was a straight A student. It wasn't that he was incapable of anything. He was very intelligent. It's just that mom and dad made a bad mistake and strictly spoke to him in the dialect. And he knew English because he'd hear it. You know, mom and dad spoke English well too, but they chose. And then Grandma lived with us, Grandma Kretsch. So the threesome, that was the dialect constantly. So you grow up, when your nose is small, you learn all those languages because you have to understand what's going on.
Around our home, we didn't seem to, I didn't seem to notice it so much, but at that time already, my older brothers and sisters, they had gone to country school with learning English as a second language from our home. But by the time I was old enough to remember, I didn't hear it so much there, partly because of the older ones in our family were already speaking English. My mother and dad would speak a lot of English. But where I would hear it is when I would be young, and especially in the summertime, when many times Otto Dietz and his hired man Ottmar would come over and visit and go around looking at the livestock and looking at the hog pens and all this stuff. And in the meantime, standing there talking about that, they would be speaking in the Bohemian dialect and that. So I would hear it from time to time on our farm, but it would not be so much of our own family speaking it. And my mother wouldn't speak it so much as her mother, of course, and her mother didn't really speak any English, so.
When I was, coming up, and like I say, where my dad went, I just followed him, and he let me, once in a while in the winter it would get really cold and stuff, and he'd say, you better go in the house or go in the barn, someplace where it's warmer, But anyhow, him and his uncle or him and his neighbors would be visiting in the German Bohemian dialect, Beimisch. And they'd be talking back and forth, and then my dad wouldn't want to say something to me. He'd switch to English. And he'd turn around and he'd talk to my uncle, and it was Beimisch again, see. But they had a rule in the house that no German around the kids, because neither of my parents could speak English when they started grade school. So they wouldn't talk English. I got to go a little further than my grandma in St. George. So when we stayed at school, she was quite a lady. She would make the evening meal. We'd have our meal, Grandpa would do the dishes, and she would do homework with us. Sit around the table, we were three of us. And when we were finished, do you understand German?
Not much.
Not much, okay. Then I'll stay with English. But after we finished our homework, she would say, now, if you children are going to live in this house, you're going to learn how to speak German. And she wouldn't speak another word of English to us until we'd done homework the next night. She knew how to teach.
I could translate something very well or anything like that, but my grandmother, once in a while, she would get so nervous and exhausted about things, and it was usually associated with things associated with the war, I think, the Second World War, when so many, the plight of her family around the world, there at different locations, and I can remember her kind of like saying something. Something about that you would get so nervous that you could just run up in the air, or just run up the wall. You know, it's kind of like a phrase now that might be, and I won't even try and say it. But anyway, that's the gist of it. Some events or something happened that was so nerve-wracking for her.
I heard German in my hometown, in my house.
Did you?
Oh, yes. Yeah, and I can remember when I started first grade, it kind of got, I didn't have any trouble though with English. Like a lot of kids that came to school had trouble because of the German. They couldn't speak anything else. My wife's aunt, she talks about that all the time, and the nuns would get kind of upset with you about doing it too.
We, in New Ulm had that thing about, if you were Catholic, then you shopped at Fasemeyer Hardware. If you were Lutheran, you shopped at Retzlaff's. And so my dad loved to hang around in the lumber yards and the hardware store. And so, yes, they would speak, but the Fasemeyers were not Bohemian. But he would go in there and they'd talk some German. And the German that I learned before I went to Germany was things that my folks would talk, and they didn't want us kids to understand, to know what they were talking about. And I think that was kind of common.
The very day that I started school, my parents began to speak English at home as well. Mother told me that she knew I would never, and my brother, who was 14 months younger, speaks a good Bohemian German as well. Most of my Bamish is pretty, it's understandable by fellow Bamish people. But when I speak to like the Bavarian people, they say, you've got some Bavarian in your dialect. And when I'm in the Ulm area, the Stuttgart area, they say I've got some Schwabish in there. Well, some of my playmates came from that area, and we spoke the dialect as kids. In the sandbox and elsewhere, we spoke the dialect. It's interesting how today, when I am in Germany, I begin dreaming in German because it is my native tongue.
Man, horseradish gravy and dumplings and chicken and oh yeah. And then we had Doge. It was like a pan, a cake pan, and it had onions, I believe, in there, and it was a big pancake, thick pancake, a poor man's meal that these German Bohemian women would dig together and put there. And Gratzet, I can't remember what Gratzet is anymore. It was like not like a funnel cake, but it was kind of something on that order too. And I remember the name of it, Gratzet, but I don't remember how it was made. My mother, it took me just to get the recipe from her for horseradish gravy and dumplings. I called my twin brother Paul and I says, today we're going to trap Mother. We are going to get that recipe from her. Because she'd always say a little of this and a little of that. So I called her up and I says, Mom, we're coming over. She goes, oh, okay, boys. And I'm bringing all the ingredients. What do you need? Why, what are we going to make? And I says, we're going to make horseradish gravy and dumplings. Okay. So we went, and then every time she'd say a little, we'd stop her. We'd measure it.
Get it down.
Yeah, we did. We spent the day and we just had a blast. I wish I'd have done that with more of the things that she made. And my grandmother, you know, man. After chores, you knew you were going to eat well because you had two fantastic cooks in the kitchen. You knew it was good. And her homemade soups and always a pie, always, and cake. That was always there. I mean, you ate like crazy, but you worked hard, but you just never starved. And then when they butchered the chicken, there wasn't much that chicken, even the rooster comb we ate.
Really?
Or the claws.
Okay.
We didn't spare.
Yeah.
We ate it all.
Yeah.
And then that good old salts, that jelly meat in a jar. Oh, that was wonderful. And back before my day, I guess, they made homemade beer.
Okay.
But Mom would say it was always a noise down in the basement when it would ferment and blow the bottle apart. And she goes, oops, and there goes another one. You know what our breakfast was before school, even when we were in high school? Yeah. It started out with fried potatoes with fried onions, side pork. Before bacon days was side pork. Molasses bread, homemade bread and molasses bread to die for. You ate so much of it. Then you'd do chores and then you'd go out. And then during the summer months when you were home and helping with farm work and a big breakfast like that again.
Yeah.
Fried potatoes, side pork. That was mandatory. You had to start out with a good breakfast. So then we'd eat that. And then about 9:30 in the morning, a lunch bucket would come out to where you were.
Okay.
And it was always a bottle of beer.
Yeah.
And a summer sausage sandwich. And then you come for a great big noon meal. To die for again. And then 3 o'clock in the afternoon, come the lunch bucket again with a bottle of beer and a summer sausage sandwich. And then you'd come home for supper with another big meal. But we'd work. And I think when I started high school, I weighed about 135.
Well, she made really great sauerkraut and potato dumplings with roast pork. And oftentimes on Sunday, we would have a veal roast with bread dumplings and a gravy, and that was also very tasty.
Oh, Grandma could make wine. Man, she always had something brewing in the basement. Always.
So what would she use for wine? Just get some.
Well, she had grapes around the chicken yard, the fence, Concord grapes, that grew up, and then they lived on the bluff of the Minnesota River, just on the north side when you go out the Weissman Road. And there was wild grapes. She'd pick them, and we'd help pick. And she would make dandelion wine, rhubarb wine.
Nice.
Oh boy, you make me think now. But she would always have something brewing in the basement. And a lot of times Grandpa would say, let's go sample the wine. And Grandma would say, it's not ready, you leave that alone.
I've always tried to write up our Angie's picnic up there in September because that kind of, you got parts of culture. The last one to be lost is cooking. You know, our speaking dialect, that, as we all know, is just less and less. So I figured, well, this is one way to kind of carry that on.
Are you kidding?
Well,
we grew up on Schmierkuchen.
My grandmother and my mother made the Schmierkuchen with the prunes. I know there's different ways of making it, but the real way they always say is with the prunes on top. And I got to love that, and I still do today.
And this was a big part of it, Schmierkuchen and klippelt lace. And beer, of course, and sauerkraut, but that goes without saying.
First recipe will be Schmierkuchen, and there are two varieties of this. And one has more of a doughy yeast crust, and topped with cottage cheese and prunes and a little cinnamon. Okay, that's number one. The second version is the one that I grew up with and I prefer, and is more of the cheesy version, or the cheesecake, which is simply a kind of a cake batter type filling, or a dough, or a filling like we see here, topped or filled with cottage cheese, cream, all kinds of good stuff, topped with prunes and cinnamon and baked. So you have more of a cheesecake feel to this one. And I do bring that to the picnic every year. It disappears. I get a lot of compliments on it. And again, it's probably the most popular and favorite German dessert in our culture. Okay, so this recipe makes 3 pans of Schmierkuchen, which I've mixed up by cottage cheese filling with cottage cheese cream and a couple other ingredients. And I was just telling Dan to point it out, in the old days, even the cottage cheese was homemade. That they used to gather the milk on Saturday, so Mom could make Schmierkuchen on Sunday. So this was really kind of a special dessert. So we'll put in our filling, and then we'll top with prunes. And I've got 1.5 pounds here. So I've cooked these the night before, and no special art to this, just kind of sprinkle them in as they work here. And then just sprinkle on top a little sugar.
So that's a little sugar.
That's a little sugar, or a lot of sugar. And I also top it with cinnamon. Okay. I'll just get the right one here. Oh, sprinkle with cinnamon. Whoops, maybe a little too much on that one. And I also like to sprinkle a little nutmeg, so I'll use a little nutmeg on this too. Okay, and the recipe I found actually was found in a cookbook from the school where I grew up, but one of the teachers was from New Ulm, and when I looked at it, I went, this is the real deal. So I would say prunes would be your more authentic fruit, but if you perhaps chose to throw in a few raisins, plums, all these, which are plums, I don't know what else, but this, this is our culture's Schmierkuchen. Oven.
How long?
1 hour at 350 degrees. Yeah, oh, okay. I think we're at the point where our Schmierkuchen is done. Let's see. Ooh. Oh, yum, yes. So, take this out. Okay, and we'll let that cool off a little bit and cut a piece.
It's my chance to have some prunes today, too.
Oh, yes, and this is
all right.
tasty.
Okay.
So, here you go, Dan. It's a little warm, so
Is that okay?
Just be careful.
Okay, okay. Oh, right amount of sugar on top.
Okay, let's try that together. Schmeckt good.
It is. Should we say bon appetit, I guess?
Or guten Appetit.
Guten Appetit,
Guten
thank you.
Appetit.
Well, I just walked across the alley to my grandpa when we were kids.
Yeah.
My cousin and I, Walter Kester, and my grandpa, and his brother who lived with him, us four played almost every night.
Really?
Okay, yeah, when we were kids. And then till we started going out with women. that was out.
Steroids is a problem.
Yeah, that'll do it.
When I turned 12. No.
What's interesting here is
Yeah.
The name sheephead or softskull
Yeah.
is wrong. Has nothing to do with sheep.
Okay.
Oh, no.
That came from Milwaukee. It's in Germany. If you go to Germany, they will not know what
Schafkopf.
sheephead is or Schafkopf. It is a short A, Schafkopf, workhead.
Oh.
Has nothing to do with sheep.
Oh, really? Workhead.
It's
Oh,
workhead.
Oh,
It's
my
workhead.
God.
Okay.
And that all came out of Milwaukee, you know. Yeah.
Yeah.
And in Milwaukee, they also played with the Spitz.
Yeah.
Yeah.
Well, that.
Yeah. Which is and that normally is played with 8 cards instead of 6.
Yeah.
Okay.
And then the 7 of diamonds was the Spitz.
Well, Charlie, I too remember growing up in Siegel with playing sheephead. That's the first game we knew how to play.
Sure.
And the other kids would play, war and all those other things, and all we know was sheephead. Black queens of the partners, and
Sure.
it was a regular affair.
When we lived out on the Hanscom Road there.
Yeah.
We had 8 couples there. Landis Moores, Wally Schnobury, Ed Static, Dennis Reinhardt, John Manderfeld, us, and there's one other couple more. Anyhow, we played every week somewhere, Everybody had a little lunch when they got done again, or whatever, and then
Yep, and there was always a lot of kidding going on. So like if you say you had the 2 black queens and you didn't call a partner or something, or you did call somebody and you shouldn't have, then you get a picture of a chicken out.
Oh yeah.
Chicken, you didn't go home.
God,
kind of
no.
the rules of the sheephead. Yeah, you chicken, and all that camaraderie. Get out of here.
And if you had all trumps, but you had only 1 black queen.
Like I
it
had
sucked
the
you all
first,
the up.
like the
Yeah.
first hand I had here.
Yeah, and you didn't.
I was wondering what they were going to say about that.
That's right. Yeah. Here's a chicken, Charlie.
No longer a partner.
Oh.
My grandmother tried to teach me, and of course I did not want to, and one in the family had to learn. So then she made me go back and forth with the bobbins just to get acquainted with the bobbins, and I did, and I do, very slow, and like her, she was going like a bat out of where, and she'd get so disgusted with me, she'd tell me, go home. Well, before long, my mother said, I'll teach you. So she taught me the handkerchief lace. That isn't this one. It's only as wide. This takes 12 bobbins. This is what they call the crab eye.
Okay.
I use this on handkerchiefs.
Okay.
Okay, you have 2 in your hands, always.
Okay.
You put the one over the second one, over, and cross under.
Okay.
Over, and cross under. And I tell my students, when you see the little diamond in that center, then you know you're right.
Okay.
And put that pair aside, pick up the next pair. And as you set your pins, it forms your design.
So you'll take that is a cardboard pattern?
Yeah, this is the cardboard pattern right here.
Okay. You take that and then you use, are there any importance to the color of the pins particularly?
It wasn't until I started teaching.
Oh.
And it helps them know what to do. I said, when you get to your red pin over here, then
Yeah.
you set your red pin.
Okay.
Then you go back and set your yellow pin.
Okay, okay. Well, that was a nice method to pick up.
Okay. And pull them tight.
Okay.
But that's the way to do it. Now this is myrtle wood.
Okay.
It has to be a very strong or hard wood because the thread will cut right off the top.
Oh, oh, sure. Okay. Now, do you have to buy the sock, the knipple sock, or can you make your own pretty much? Or?
I made them all.
Oh, okay, okay.
I made them all.
Yeah.
Now to make the crab eyes,
Yes.
you have to make sure you're not twisted because if you start and untwist it, then it isn't right. Okay. You take your pin and set it, take the second bobbin and just make a loop. And you're done.
My aunt, Letty Hamann, my mother's sister, she did knippling.
Did she?
And she did it out at the Heritage Fest. She was in one of those buildings out there. So she would always be out there doing that. One time, she gave away this little deal that said I knippled or something like that. I said, I'd like to get one of those. She says, you have to do an inch. So I sat down and I did an inch of it. And then later she realized I had a feeling for that part of our relation. So she put together a knipple sack for me. My dad made the frame that it sits in. And she gave a whole bunch of laces with it, just pieces that you can kind of see different patterns. And the knipples themselves were made by Artie Dietz, because he was one of the few people that was doing it at that time, and they were out of Walnut. So we have that, and I bring it to every one of our big events, you know, because that's just part of who we are. Yeah.
German Bohemians were a people close to the land, people of the earth. But the center of their existence was the church, daily prayers at home, weekly mass, and the celebration of the liturgical year on holidays and special occasions. Even though they were
the
not
pioneer
wealthy,
Catholic
they
priest
built
in
beautiful
this
churches,
area was
Holy
the Father
Trinity,
Valentine
St.
Summerisen.
George's,
Valentine
St.
Summerisen
Mary's,
was
Sleepy
born in
Eye,
Alsace,
and later St.
in
Mary's
what
in
is now France.
We visited St.
They were all
Joseph's,
German speaking there at the
First
time,
Baptist
depending
Church
upon
in
who had
Brown County,
won the last
located
war.
in Cottonwood Township.
He was recruited to become a priest here, a missionary priest. Summarizing began his missionary activities throughout southwestern Minnesota, what became New Ulm, Sleepy Eye, Springfield, St. George. This whole general area here was Valentine Summarizen's mission territory. He celebrated the first Mass at this church in 1861. He ministered to the Catholics here for a number of years, and he was in New Ulm in 1862 inside the barricades when the Indian Wars were going on in late mid-August of 1862.
This was up in service in 1859, approximately, and during that time, baptisms and different things were services were held here, quite likely, and the records of the baptisms and so forth are important for our family, particularly because there was a Margaret. There was a sister to my grandfather that was born in 1861, the year before the Indian Uprising. And so she was 1 year old here. And after the Indian Uprising, I think it might have been recorded as in 1864 or thereabouts, she was baptized here at probably at this church.
Really? Okay.
And recorded in the book of her baptism recordings.
Yeah.
So that's real significant for our Eckstein family in particular, and then she happened to be a mother of children. She married a Losleben, and there was a father, Father Losleben, Anthony Losleben, from Sleepy Eye, north of Sleepy Eye.
Yeah.
He was the first pastor then. He was ordained in 1908, and he was the first pastor at St. Mary's Church here in New Ulm. So it's particularly important, this church, because the mother of our first pastor was baptized here.
Obviously, in the fall time, it would be Advent, and on a weekly basis, on Sunday afternoons, there would be benediction. So people would go to church in the morning. There, of course, were no Saturday services then, but morning masses on Sunday morning. But then to come back at 2 o'clock in the afternoon for benediction, and very often the children were the ones that would sing the songs at benediction. So it was another half an hour that people would spend in church. Not everybody, of course, but some. So that was something that occurred all the time. Another thing that occurred all the time, being a student at a Catholic school, you went to Mass every morning, and if you went to communion, you brought along your breakfast, and you'd sit at your desk and eat your breakfast. The other things from processing through the year, of course, Advent and Christmas, prepping for First Communion for some grades, prepping for First Confessions, penance, that sacrament, and then First Communion. And then at that time, there was something in 4th grade called Solemn Holy Communion, sort of a step between Holy Communion and Confirmation. And so that was another occasion to buy a nice white dress for the procession and all that. So those preparations took place, sacramental preparations took place in spring. Yeah. And then in May was wonderful. We would have the May crowning. The month of May is Mary's month, and so Blessed Mary's month. And so we would have a procession, and since church was right in the same building, and there wasn't a lot of processing you could do inside the building, we would go to the corner and then process back, or go around the playground and then process back inside into church and down the aisle into church. And May crowning, where one of the older girls would be and a couple of the other older girls would be the May crowning attendants, if you will, and would actually put a little wreath of flowers on the statue of Mary. That was a big deal. And we'd all have a reason to wear a white dress again. So you could pull it out of the closet and wear it again, so, if it fit you yet. So that kind of took us through the year. When you were older, then of course you had confirmation in the spring, and liturgically that kind of took us through Advent and then Lent, of course, and spring preparation for sacraments.
Well, yes, the church, of course, was a very important part of our life here in New Ulm, my life here in New Ulm, and our particular family. We had quite a few times when we would go to church, not only so much on Sunday, but other times with different feast days or something like that would be important for our family to be in attendance at church, and so it was very important. And if at all possible, we would get there when needed. Weather limited us, but not too much on that account, and so it was very important for us, and it as a family, and but some of the interesting things along the way, I remember some of the most interesting times were when we had processions and that at St. Mary's, like usually May processions, when we'd be able to walk, and I think of some of the most interesting service type were the ones that had included a bit of activity, like processions, where you'd be able to walk, and in procession, and that, and as a school student in school down at St. Mary's, we'd get some of that associated with the school, so that was always good. But some of the other ones are even like the Way of the Cross that we, in Lent, it was always prominent, and there again, I don't know if, because at every station you'd be getting up and then saying a prayer and kneeling down, and you'd have this physical activity that would be like processions with walking, and then this activity of Way of the Cross. So these are some things that were, I don't know, important for me at the time.
And that was, like I say, about 6 blocks away from Trinity. And my grandpa, when Wenzel held it, he went to Mass every day. And he would take my mother, as a little youngster, either in the wagon or on the sled to Mass every day.
We went to church every Sunday, and then I also think that my parents prayed the rosary. And I think that really is away from church.
Yes.
You know, it's in the home. And then you have prayer before, and I think that also, before each meal. And I think that also makes a big difference.
German Bohemians also brought along their native folk beliefs. Pat Kretsch remembers his grandfather.
Loved his family, loved his wife. They would say the rosary every night together, kneeling on the floor. And he had that special power of healing with a rosary, but with a thread. If you had a wart, he'd put this and he'd say certain prayers, and that was supposed to be passed on to the youngest, to Aunt Lillian, and to this day she's so sad it never did get passed on to her. So it stopped. But he could heal. I mean, you were healed. It never came back. When Grandpa said it won't come back, it didn't. You know, it's just unreal. It was just something else. But yeah.
And we had Sister Loretta when I was a freshman, and she was real heavy set. And I was playing concertina. I was 14 that time, and I was during the noon hour. I had my concertina right in the classroom. And so then when the kids come back from playing outside, I'd be playing and stuff. Well, anyhow, here comes Sister Loretta, and she was real heavy set. In those days, this was 1946. I don't want her, you can have her, she's too fat for me. That was a big song. So I'm sitting on her desk in front playing, and I started playing that, and she come in. At first I see she was going to get mad. All of a sudden she started dancing from the door all the way up to the up to the front of the desk. No kidding. Yeah, I don't want her, you can have her, she's too fat for me. Yeah, Sister Loretta.
We didn't even know, though, that we were that much German Bohemian. We were always led to believe like Austrian. You know.
Is that what the family?
I think we're more Austrian than we are German. Didn't really want to talk about it.
German-speaking Bohemians were known as the quiet immigrants, lacking the high profile of other ethnic groups in the upper Midwest: Germans, Swedes and Norwegians, Irish and Italians. Official records often recorded them as German or Austrian. Then, in 1984, the German Bohemian Heritage Society was founded, gathering people together to share and explore their common ancestry and their rich culture.
We never thought of that German Bohemian thing. I just knew that my dad's family came from Austria, Bohemia, Austria. And it wasn't that I thought too much about it. Once it was about the same time that that was how Bob Paulson and I met. We had both been to Czechoslovakia, and were the Russians had invaded Czechoslovakia, and both of us had the guns held on us. So, and shortly after that, Bob came here to see what I knew, and then we discussed that.
Yes, we did. What we did, in order to gather material for the book, and it was Vern's idea. He said that we should have kind of a town meeting. And so the next question was, how do we get all these German Bohemians to come to the town meeting? And so what I did is I went to the New Ulm paper and to the Sleepy Eye paper and explained what our project was. And we also ran a couple of ads in each one of these newspapers listing the family names that we had researched. And they said, if this is your name, you come to this meeting and we'll talk about your ethnicity and where your people came from. And we were talking, and also talked to Marlene, and she gave me a whole list of, we went through the telephone books of Nicollet and Brown County and mailed out invitations, well over 100 invitations to this meeting. And it was in November of 1984. And
where was it?
It was down in the library of the basement meeting room of the library, and we had 60 people there. And we split up into little groups, and each group would have a topic. One would be about food, another one would be about weddings, another one would be about religion or church, or another one would be about farming practices, and on and on. So. And then we had them all sign in, and they were all excited about this. This was quite something, and we explained that, you know, this has never been done and never been written, and their people are important, and so it kind of gave them a little enthusiasm. Well, they said, let's do this again, and so out of that, then we had another one in January of 1985. It was 20 below zero, and we had 90 people there. They came, and they decided they wanted to make it into a society, and we had the first president was Adeline Wilford, who was Whoopi John's eldest daughter, and so from then on we went, and things grew into the monument, into the books, into the music, into the society.
One of the lasting gifts of the German Bohemian Heritage Society is the monument in German Park in New Ulm. Erected in 1991, more than 350 immigrant family names are inscribed in granite slabs around the base of the monument.
was sitting at Perkins one day, and the book was well on its way. And they said, in order we keep this society going, we got to have some kind of a project. And I said, well, we can, all these German Bohemian farmers like seed corn hats, so we could get hats. But we thought we'd get something a little more lasting than that. Well, Louis happened to see out near Pioneer Park that the junior pioneers had put up a rock and had about the junior pioneers, and and I said, well, let's put some kind of a monument up. And I, okay, Louis, that sounds like a good idea. Well,
once a decision had been made to erect the monument, the Heritage Society needed to raise the money to pay for it, select a site, and hire a sculptor. Thanks to Rudy Kiefner, a cousin of George and Angie Portner, and a friend to many, the Society connected with Leopold Hofner, a talented German Bohemian sculptor who created the statue.
He came up, we kind of let him come with his idea. I remember us talking about it in a board meeting, well, let's see what he comes up with, and we'll kind of go from there. We'll see if we like it or not. And when we saw it, we loved it. It was just exactly what we wanted. We weren't real in favor of Rudy's idea with the plow and the ox, but we thought Leopold's three, mother, father, and child, was perfect. I remember it was very hot, and it was during Heritage Fest. It was the weekend of Heritage Fest. And we had rented chairs the city blocked the street off for us. And we had rented chairs and had them set up, and finding that we hope we filled these chairs. Well, we overfilled them. We had no idea that many people would come to the dedication. People had a stand in the back, and the sun was beating down. It was a very warm day. It was in the 90s, hot and humid like July likes to get. And so I remember that. I remember the speeches that were given. I recall we had the monument covered with a blue tarp, and then at a certain point the ropes were pulled and the monument was on display. And I had seen it, of course, before that, so I knew what it looked like, but it was the first time it was open to the public.
I am a good person. Ich bin a goude Mensch. Abandon, verloren. I will never abandon you. Ich dou die nie verloren. Abandoned, verloren. He was abandoned. Der war verloren.
Older generations of German Bohemians remember the words and phrases heard at home, on the farms, and in the stores in town. But as generation succeeded generation, it was heard less frequently and then for most forgotten. As a noted linguist, Daniel Nutzel, told an academic conference, New Ulm German Bohemian is dying a typical gradual death. Not willing to lose the language of his youth, Paul Kretsch began a heroic effort to collect information and record the dialect, eventually supported by Nutzel himself. The result was one of the Heritage Society's greatest contributions, the German Bohemian Dialect Remembered, published in 2009. It all began, though, with the German Bohemian Heritage Singers, a group organized by Paul to preserve the folk songs of the homeland.
Darfst du auf Milch verkaufen? Kann nicht, wenn ich wollte, kann ich es aufdrücken. Ich habe was anderes gemeint. Ich denke auf den Misthafen, wo sie kriegt für der Kau. Misthafen? Hoho, der will ein Kaudreck verkaufen. Old
Shine varma country, du bist der alle Scout. In winterfyren Mossley, in sommerfyren.
And then how he learned the music, he listened to a tape and he wrote the words down as he'd listen. And then he'd give that tape to Arlene Verajka. She listened to it and wrote the notes down. That's how we got our music. From the Homeland, you know, those songs. And then we did get songbooks from Rudy Kiefner, which were a big help. But that's where my twin brother learned how to read the dialect and write in the dialect were from them songbooks. Where to place umlauts, because Dan Nitzel said to me, Pat, he was the editor of Paul's book, and he says, where did your brother learn how to read and write? He says, he didn't become a linguist. I go, I know. I says, I'm puzzled with that. But then later, I said, Dan, I think I know. He read all those music books, and those are all from Rudy Kiefner and the Beer Sisters, Waltrud and Heidi. They were all written in the umlaut, where the umlaut should be. And I says, that's how he learned.
He said he always liked listening to it. You know, most people like me, of course, I didn't even want to hear what my grandparents were saying, you know, in German. I just wanted to understand it. But he grew up, I mean, his family, when his relatives, because they were all here, when they would get together, they always talked the dialect, apparently. And he said he would always hear that, and he loved listening to them. So he paid more attention to that. So he grew up, you know, because they probably spoke to him that language. Ernie, his older brother, you know, when he started school, he didn't even know English. And that caused a problem in school. So they didn't want Pat and Paul and, you know, to have to go through that. So they made sure they spoke English too. But when the family got together, they talked the dialect. They spoke the dialect, and that was, he was just so interested in it. And then as he, you know, when he grew up, he knew that his generation was probably the last generation that would even know that language. And so he got that in his head, I guess, that because it wasn't a written language, he didn't want it to die. Yeah. And so that's, and I don't know when in his mind he started thinking he should write these words down, but he did. And then when we got a computer, you know, he started, and, you know, he'd be doing something and all of a sudden he'd be in the computer room. Something would come and he said that this is a word he's got to put in it. And so he did. And he worked many, many years on it. And had he not died, I wonder if he'd still be working on it, because, you know, because he'd always think of new things he wanted in there, you know. I mean, it's a dictionary of sorts, but of course there's many, many words missing. But he just worked hard on it, night and day.
Now, how did he work on particular words sometimes that stumped him a little bit?
Oh, he'd call his mother, or if she wasn't sure, then he'd call somebody else that knew the language. I mean, he had kind of a lifeline that he would call different people if he just didn't know how to say it, or you know, how to translate it. So, and then of course when it came to actually putting it together, he wanted to put it on some kind of a tape. But he, at that time, he said he didn't know how to do it, because he'd have, you know, 50 tapes, and he didn't, you know, we didn't know quite how to put it together, and it just so he was still struggling with a lot of that, you know, when he got sick, and so that really, really bothered him, that he wasn't going to live to finish that dictionary. That was his biggest concern, not dying, but that his dictionary wouldn't get finished.
The 93 trip, I found some wild roses in bloom alongside this trail, and I picked a bunch of wild roses and I put them on my great-grandfather's grave, St. Mary's Cemetery in Sleepy Eye. So He wasn't able to come here, but at least I could celebrate his life, huh?
Soon after its founding, Heritage Society members began trips back to the homeland, searching for ancient villages and distant cousins. As one visitor wrote, "Now I sense the distant lands and share their landscape. The people now have names, and the present people, now we have shared memories. My roots are reconnected, and my ancestors smile."
I've been on 3 trips with the GBHS. I mean, how many groups, how many history groups, genealogy groups do you join where you actually have connections that take you back to the old country, to your villages? I mean, it's just been a wonderful experience to be part of this group. And then connecting with Bob and doing research, we tried to find Jungrindel. It's one of those rare villages that was completely destroyed, which probably from World War II. Some of them were destroyed for other reasons, but it was hard to find it, hard to find the ruins. So the first trip, we started in Rindel and we went up the hill as far as we could before we were so winded we gave up. I mean, we found something we thought was it, but it wasn't very much ruins, and we gave up and went back down. Second trip, you know, we looked at the maps more, the old maps that existed, and we tried a different approach. We came from higher up the hill, found hiking roads or logging roads, and came down as far as we thought. It still wasn't the right location. We found some ruins, but it wasn't quite it. Finally, the third trip, we had found a new internet site that had old maps overlaid to new maps, so it was easier to figure out that we were close, but there was just a little side cut of a road that was the way back. So that last trip, Bob wasn't able to go with us, but I was with my dear friends, my Heimat brothers, Louis and Jim, and we started out the day, and it was stormy. It was starting to rain, and it was blustery. And just before we were going to go visit the Jungrindel site, our Czech guide, with a little language confusion, he took us all the way deep into the Bommerwald, the Bohemian forest. I mean, it's beautiful, gorgeous trees, but we didn't quite understand where he was taking us. We just followed along, and he took us to the Hirstein, to the ruins of the Hirstein castle, and it was very interesting. But we're deep into the woods, and the rain is coming, and the thunder is rolling, and the lightning is crashing. We're like, it just gets worse and worse. So by the time we got back to the vehicle, we were drenched. We were soaked. So we reconfigured our stops for the day and did some other places that were closer to the vehicle until the rain let up. So we ended up having to wait till the end of the day to go to Jungrindel. I was miserable. I couldn't get dry feet. You know, your shoes get wet. And what do? You're out in the middle of nowhere. And so we finally stopped at the end of the day, and we start walking. The sun is finally coming out. The sky is clearing. We had a rainbow, and it's coming down right on the site of Jungrindel. You know, I was so excited. I just kind of bolted off and ran ahead of everybody. I was just like, it's here. There's a rainbow. This is just a perfect magic moment. Magic moment.
I guess so. You know, maybe they thought, well, you know, yeah, my grandma's as good as your grandma. You know, and maybe they felt, I didn't live down there that much, but maybe they felt that they had something unique, and they felt they should be recognized for what they have. I don't know. I don't think the Turners and the powers to be actually, you know, intentionally, I don't care to use the word discriminate or look down, but it was kind of there. It was kind of there. And so I think this kind of, what was it? they came out. Yeah, they can be proud of who they are, and that, to me that was the whole purpose of the whole idea.
There's almost something, I mean, the mystery behind the German Bohemian heritage. When you start researching and you see German here, some folks see a little Bohemian listed here. It's very rare in the old records where you might see a Deutsche Bohm or German Bohemian. I mean, it doesn't exist. So there's something validating in finding GBHS. And you know, I'm not crazy. This research is true. My people were from someplace, and it's important as everybody else's places. But I have a definition of who I am now. I'm German Bohemian.
I am German Bohemian.
Well, I am German Bohemian.
I am German Bohemian.
Ich bin ein Babe.
I am a German Bohemian.
We are German Bohemian.
I am German Bohemian.
I am German Bohemian.
I am German Bohemian.
Ich bin Deutsch, Böhmisch.